Still no watchman. Time passed slowly in the tunnel, and I was increasingly aware of the total lack of watchmen, or more accurately, anything. Bourbon had asked for backup in dealing with mutants, and sure, maybe I could help with that, maybe even help deal with a passing bandit. But into the darkness, in back and in front, there appeared to be nothing. Nothing but the melody of the tunnel, and sometimes a damned rat. Although they too had become scarce once again. We turned, and Bourbon grumbled, "Up ahead is an old gate. It's stiff, but it works, so don't worry that we've ended up in a dead end or some shit." I was sick and tired of Bourbon's constant implied insults, those subtle little backhanded assertions that I was, this quivering, frightened child. Who the hell did this guy think he was? The constant coarseness of his character would be enough to make anyone snap. I wondered then how many times someone had landed the old fool on his arse. We came into a large passage, totally lit by the glow of mushrooms, a sickly green. There were so many of the damn things clinging to the walls that I almost didn't notice as Bourbon heaved over a railing and started fiddling with the gate he had talked about. "All right, my darling, let's see if you remember little old me." He reacquainted himself with the old thing. The mist from my breath in the cool air and the faint vapor that permeated the room looked like swirling clouds in the dim light of the mushrooms. I looked up in awe, thinking that perhaps there was a sort of beauty in the metro. It was then that I felt a faintness in my head, as though I were back in the railcar with Eugene. I wobbled and steadied myself on a pylon, staring at my feet to make sure they were still in fact holding me upright, as I heard Bourbon call out, "I don't want to be stuck in this fucking graveyard, Artyon, so start checking those boys for bullets and shit. We're going to need them where we're going. I'll get this fucking door open, don't worry." His words weren't making any sense. I squinted and tried to swallow the slimy ball that had swelled in the back of my throat, and then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw the bodies. Hidden beneath the blanket of vapor and light, bodies like crimpled carpet covered the floor. Some traders, some stalkers, some wearing their gas masks, as though they thought they were being killed by some unseen gas, yet they too were just as dead as the maskless ones. I looked up to Bourbon to ask him what the hell had happened here. There were no marks on the bodies. Watchmen didn't do this. But as my gaze lifted again, the world around me turned white. Wind hit my face and ears, and I reached for the pylon for support, only to collapse, finding it gone. Now, I was in some sort of corridor. The room from before was gone, but ahead of me I could still see Bourbon fiddling with the door. But beyond it now was a piercing white ether. I tried to stagger toward him. Could he not hear my struggle? Was the man deaf? I tried to call his name again, but it was then that a wet, slimy hand, cold as snow and almost as large as my face, slithered over my mouth and turned me around, forced me to face its master. I saw, closer than ever, a dark one, standing over me, its eyes, its gash-like maw, its being chilling my soul. My screams died in my throat, and I watched with bulging eyes as it raised a single finger to its lips, or whatever it had that looked like lips, in a faux shh fashion. Then, in a blink, it was gone, and a short, sharp scream pinged through the room as I was returned to the mushroomed passage. Bourbon jumped at the sound and spat. "What the fuck are you doing? Trying to give me a heart attack? What the fuck is wrong with you, you prick? Damn it, I knew I should have never brought you with me, you dumb little fuck!" And his rants turned to grumbles, and then finally mumbles. He turned back to the door, and once he had opened it and angrily gestured for me to walk through, I thought of perhaps telling him what had happened to me, what I saw. But would he even believe me? No, of course not. Worst case scenario, he'd accuse me of contracting something from the rats, maybe one of those plagues from the farthest stations. No, I wouldn't tell him. I slid past him through the opening and offered a weak, "Sorry." But Bourbon only scowled. The tunnel that lay before us was totally black, and an unusual, total, absolute darkness reigned. It was so thick you could almost touch it. As porous as a sponge, it greedily swallowed the beams of our flashlights, which were hardly sufficient to illuminate even a meter ahead. Straining to the limits of my hearing, I tried to discern even the smallest germ of sound. Any sound. But nothing. Noise probably had as hard a time as getting through all this darkness as light did. Even the bold crashing of Bourbon's boots sounded limp and muted in this tunnel. On the right wall, suddenly, there was a gap. My flashlight beam was swallowed by it, and I didn't immediately understand that it was a side passage that broke off from the main tunnel. I looked at Bourbon questioningly. "Don't be scared. There was a transfer passage here," he explained, "so that trains could directly go onto the ring without transferring at another station, but the Hansa filled it in. They're not fools. They wouldn't leave an open tunnel pointing straight at them." After that, we walked in silence for quite a long time. But the silence was getting more and more oppressive, and finally, I couldn't bear it. "Listen, Bourbon," I said, trying to disperse any hallucinations. "Is it true that the caravan got wiped out by some invisible watcher in this tunnel before?" I tried, with Eugene's story in my head, thinking to invoke the old tunnel myth of invisible watchers, so that Bourbon wouldn't think that I was totally batshit insane. "I heard something like that, but I wasn't here, so I can't be sure." His words made a dull sound, and I barely caught their sense, and had a hard time of separating the words I heard from my own grinding thoughts about the fact that everything was so hard to hear in this tunnel. "What? Did anyone see it? There are stations at either end of the tunnel. Surely someone can back up what Eugene said." I continued, but not because I was particularly interested in the answer, but simply because I wanted to hear my own voice. I hadn't even noticed that I had said Eugene by name, even though Bourbon had no way of knowing who that was. Several minutes went by before Bourbon replied at last, but this time I didn't want to rush him, as there was an echo of the words that I had just said going in the back of my head, and I was too busy listening to them. "They say that somewhere in here there is a kind of hatch, but it's covered over. It's not very visible. Well, how likely is it, anyway, that you'd see something in this darkness, Bourbon added with a sort of unnatural irritation in his voice. It took some time for me to remember what it was that we were actually talking about, and I agonizingly tried to make sense of it all, and tried to pose another question, simply because I wanted to continue the conversation. Even if it was clumsy and difficult, it was saving us from the silence. "And was it always so dark in here?" I asked, feeling a little spooked that my words made such little sound, as though there was something covering my ears. Duh. Yes, always. Everywhere is dark. It comes in. The great darkness, and it shrouds the world, and it will dominate eternally. Bourbon responded, making strange pauses. What's that, a book or something? I said, noticing that I had to make increasing effort to catch the sound of my own words, and also aware of the fact that Bourbon's language had altered in a frightening way. But I didn't have enough strength to be surprised by this. A book? Be afraid. Our truth sealed in ancient volumes, where words are embossed on golden paper, slate black. They don't decay. Bourbon said ponderously, and I was struck that the man wasn't turning to speak to me as he had before. Yeah, beautiful, I almost yelled. Where does that passage come from? And the beauty was drawn, crushed, and the prophets will choke, endeavoring to pronounce their definitions. For a day, the future will be blackest than their most ominous. Fears and what they see will poison their reason. Bourbon continued quietly. Suddenly, he stopped, and he turned his head to the left so sharply that I could hear how his vertebrae cracked. He looked me dead in the eye. I started and stepped backwards, groping for my machine gun just in case. Bourbon stared at it with wide open eyes, but his pupils were two tiny dots, even though that, in the darkness, they should have been thrown open to their limit in an attempt to capture as much light as possible. His face seemed unnaturally peaceful. Not a single muscle was tense, and there was even a contemptuous smile that had slipped from his lips.
I died,
Bourbon said.
There is no more me.
And as if the very life had been blown out of him, he dropped face down. It was then that a sound hit me at full volume, encompassing me and knocking me to my feet. Drowning in this new sound of the tunnel, I laid out on the ground, unable to find the strength to move for some time. But once I covered my ears and screamed as loud as I could, I found I could stand, and feverishly I scanned the walls for whatever the source of the sound could be. But the sound was coming from somewhere above. Bourbon was lying there, immobile, face down. Rolling him over with a foot, I saw that his eyes were still wide open. Letting the sound back into one ear, I reached for Bourbon's wrist, trying hard to remember what to do in a situation like this. I tried to feel for a pulse. Even if it was erratic or weak as a thread, that was something I could work with. But it was useless. Bourbon was dead. Unwilling to accept it, I tried uselessly to grab at his hands and pull him to safety. But where was that? Forward. Forward was the only way I could go. But with Bourbon's hands in mine, his limp, heavy body dragging with each step, the sound grew louder and louder in my ears. There was no other choice. I had to leave him, or I'd die. I let him fall from my grip and tried hard not to look back at him. I covered my ears again and staggered onward. But it was only a few seconds after that my wobbly knees gave and I tumbled to the floor, my face hitting something soft and wet. Looking up, just like at the gate, I saw bodies stretching as far as I could see, all down the railway line. Bodies of those that had come before and had been foolish enough to use this tunnel. I looked to the darkness in front and behind and screamed, "Help!" But the last sound that I heard was not a human voice, but the rustle of rat paws. G'day guys, I hope you enjoyed that story and thank you so much for giving it a listen. Remember, if you want some more scary stories, you can go to the Scary Stories for Late Nights playlist. Duskbowl has been a fantastic project to work on, and remember, if you've got any fanfic or fan art or any just questions about the series, feel free to email me at duskbowl.fm@gmail.com. I love every single one of you, and you've made being a microtuber probably one of the best experiences of my life. I want to give special thanks to my patrons, of course, being Lady Nevermore, Skulk Queen, Catherine Gordon, The Curator, and Stephen Stevens. If you see them in the comments, please say g'day. And to all of you, I bid you logs of love and shit shippers.